So there's this rumor that's been going around on the left that the Second Amendment has lived past its use state, that it's expired. There's no reason for us to worry about the right to keep and bear arms anymore. Well, the right to keep and bear arms is undergirded by two separate rights, the right to personal self-defense and the right to protect your rights. So the right to self-defense pre-exists government. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, philosophers who were respected by the Founding Fathers, particularly Locke, talked about the fundamental right of any human being being your right to self-preservation, your right to self-defense. And what Locke had to say about that was that when a government is formed, in a state of nature, you have the right to self-defense. When a government is formed, you don't give up that right to the government. Hobbes thought you give up that right to the government. Now it was the government's job to protect you. Locke said it is the government's job to protect you, but that's just because the government can organize better. You do not give up your personal right to self-preservation when a government is formed. That right cannot be outsourced. It is inalienable. It's the right to life, liberty, property, according to John Locke, and as codified in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And it's the government's job to protect those rights, not to take away your own ability to protect your own rights. Okay, the right to protect your rights is the second right that is protected by the Constitution of the United States. Okay, the Declaration of Independence says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And the founders were very clear that this right included the ability to have arms. Alexander Hamilton wrote glowingly about the ability of people to own arms in Federalist 46. He praised, quote, the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. He, like all the other founders, saw ownership of arms as a check on tyranny. So, you need a gun for two reasons. One, somebody's coming into your house, you need to shoot them. And two, you have a tyrannical government, and you must have the arms available to form, what they call in the Constitution, a well-regulated militia to prevent government tyranny and to prevent foreign intrusion. Now, the question is, does this logic still apply? Well, obviously, the first logic still applies. If someone's breaking into your house, you still need to be able to shoot them. And very few people will argue this point. Even folks on the left will generally not argue this point. But they say, how can an armed population prevent tyranny? Obviously, the federal government, God forbid, the federal government were to go tyrannical, what could we do as armed citizens to stop any of that from happening? And the answer is, an armed citizenry is the greatest preemptive check on the government going tyrannical in the first place. Meaning the government knows that if they were to go tyrannical, it would be very difficult to disarm all the people of Texas. And one of the reasons that you have a right to keep and bear arms is so that the government cannot take away your right to keep and bear arms, in other words. As to the notion that an armed population can't stop a greater superpower, unfortunately, I would give the examples of Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. The fact is that small arms can make all sorts of trouble for a larger, more well-armed enemy. And it is, again, worth noting that what it's really there for is the deterrent effect. And it has worked in American history before, sometimes for bad and sometimes for good. This is not to say that every use of arms against the government is a good thing. It is to say that if the government were to do something unquestionably evil, that the capacity of the people to stand up for that's a very important thing. And it does have an impact on public policy. Actually, the most recent example is what happened with the Bundy family, where you saw the Bundy family actually checking the excesses of the federal government, and then there was a mistrial in their trial. So basically, the federal government backed off. They were allowed to feed their cattle on what was public land, but they said they had a historic right to use that land, and there was essentially a hung jury. The jury said, okay, well, that's the right. And what happened as a result of all this? It was one factor in an election that brought about a president who decided to scale back the encroachment of the federal government into public lands. There's a history of that. That goes all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion, which took place in the late 18th century, that was an armed uprising against the federal government. It was put down. But the effect of it was that John Adams lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson and the whiskey tax was repealed. So in other words, it's a little bit more complex than the resisting force has to defeat the invading force. It's more about the idea the federal government knows the cost of doing things that are too terrible. And that still holds true. And it's held true throughout history. The idea that a democracy cannot go tyrannical is belied by virtually every democracy in the history of the world, most of which have gone tyrannical at some point or another. And just on a moral level, people should be able to defend themselves against tyranny. And my entire extended family, my grandparents moved here, my great-grandparents moved here, but their extended family remained in Europe. They were slaughtered by the Nazis. I'm not suggesting that if all the Jews in Europe had had guns, they would have been able to stop the Nazis, but I am suggesting they would have been able to kill a lot more of the bastards before things went bad. So folks on the left try to look at the text of the Second Amendment. They try to suggest that the text of the Second Amendment means that there is no individual right to keep and bear arms, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, that's a complete misread. Okay, the misread that the left puts on this is that you have to be a member of the militia in order for you to keep and bear arms. This is a complete misread of history. It is utterly untrue. The meaning of this amendment was not in the slightest doubt at the time of the Constitution. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, there are already 8 states that had their own Bill of Rights. All of them guaranteed an individual right to keep and bear arms. One of the chief purposes of that right was to serve in militias that, again, could serve as a check against an overreaching federal government. Virtually all of these state constitutions said the same thing. Here's Pennsylvania's. The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their state. In New Hampshire, at the ratification convention for the Constitution, they passed this resolution. Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. The text of the Constitution is absolutely clear. Every time the Constitution says the right of the people to do X, it is an individual right. The right of the people to be free from illegal search and seizure is not a right of us as a collective, it's an individual right against the federal government, as Justice Scalia says in DC versus Heller. So what regulations are possible? So the suggestion here is not that you should be able to own a nuclear missile or that you should be able to own a bazooka per se. Right? The suggestion here is that there are certain arms that clearly fall within the ambit of the Second Amendment. So the stupid idea that you've been hearing parroted on the media, that, for example, you don't have a right to a rifle under the Constitution of the United States, that you only have a right to muskets or flintlocks, and the weapons that were available at the time of the Second Amendment, this is just as stupid as saying that Twitter is not protected by the First Amendment because the founders didn't have the internet.
Hey everybody, this is Charlie Kirk, founder and CEO of Turning Point USA. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Turning Point USA.